All right, hooray for technology. Okay. Welcome to the Plan Commission, Skokie Plan Commission meeting for March 16th. And let's see. First of all, we'll call the roll. Commissioner Osley?
Present.
Very good. Oh, here we go. Commissioner Manchella?
Present.
Commissioner Scott Berman?
Here.
Commissioner Franklin?
Here.
Commissioner Mike Shaw?
Here.
Pardon me. Commissioner Giovannahu is absent. Commissioner Jeff Berman is absent. Commissioner Ross Matei?
Here.
And I'm here. I'm present. So we do have a quorum. First order of business, approval of the minutes from the last meeting. Do I have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
Thank you. Peter, do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Minutes have been approved.
I'll abstain, though, because I wasn't on the board at that time.
I understand that. Thank you. Okay. The first case before us tonight, actually three cases that are related. Case 2023-03P, site plan approval at 3301 to 3321 Howard Street. And cases 2023-04P and cases 2023-5P. That is a special use permit, or the last two cases are special use permits. Paul, you have a contact from the petitioner?
Yeah, that's right. They can.
Just before, Council, I believe their notice is not in order, is that correct?
That's correct. I haven't received anything. I have not received anything. That's correct.
Okay. All right, Paul? Yes, Paul?
Yeah, thanks. Paul Reese, planning manager. Yes, I've been in communication with the applicant. They've asked for a continuance on all three of the items on the agenda to a date of May 4th.
May
for the planning
4th.
commission on May 4th.
Okay. And you explained to them how their notice should be handled?
Yes, absolutely.
So they understand that?
They do.
Okay, very good. So is anybody here for these cases? All right, just want to let you know that these cases will be heard on May 4th. Okay. Next order of business is the discussion on affordable housing. And I'm going to ask our Johanna Naden to give us some comments on what the staff has been doing.
Okay. We have a PowerPoint that looks similar to last time, but just wanted to update everybody on a couple of revisions based on the discussion, and then also talk a little bit about the inclusionary housing pieces of in terms of some next steps. So we moved goal A that was previously, I think, a different goal towards the end to just indicate the priority and temporal nature of study, assess, and report on ongoing supply and demand for inclusive, affordable housing in Skokie. I think getting a better understanding as a community of what we all mean when we talk about affordable housing. It can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, and getting a better narrative over what that means and help educate people that this is something that we already have in the community, and that there are opportunities to enhance and continue to grow that piece. And then nothing else changed about these goals other than sort of reorienting that order. So goal A, same as effectively same as before, but just putting it back at the front, and then also with the understanding of report, adding that bullet of report on the affordable housing work. So making sure that we're communicating out the work that's being done and getting feedback.
Let me interrupt your presentation for just a moment. I'm sorry, I need to interrupt for just a moment. My apologies, Scott Berman. I failed to announce that Mr. Berman has been not a new member, but a reinstated member of the Plan Commission. And so he's been gone for what, 5 years? See, it's okay, just 2. Oh, it seems like 5, Scott. But, you know, he's been, I've known him for a long time, and the reason why, you know, it's so comfortable to have him here, I just forgot that he's new, kind of new. So, welcome, thank you.
Thank you for welcoming.
Yes.
Okay, and then goal B, reminder, preserve, protect, and improve Skokie's existing affordable housing. We bolster our existing repair programs. We've added in, study the feasibility of establishing a Skokie land trust. And I think this was actually in an earlier iteration of these documents, but the idea that we look at home ownership opportunities, but effectively taking out the value of the land from the home to make it more affordable and help people get on that escalator of home ownership while not encumbering properties as unaffordable once somebody sells it in a neighborhood that has appreciating values. Create a vacant home registry. We've heard some discussion about concerns with vacant homes. There's some census data that might indicate that we have more vacant homes. That could be a piece of of a plan for a Skokie Land Trust if we look to opportunities where we find available land. If homes are not in use, how do we put them into use and hopefully in an affordable way? And then code enforcement of rental units. We've talked about making sure that people have safe, accessible homes that they can age in place. Rental, we have about 27% of our property, of our housing population is in rental units, making sure that those units are safe, but also at the same time supporting landlords to make sure that they can provide those safe units and keep the rents affordable. Goal C, reduce jobs housing mismatch. When people live where they work, near where they work, and are able to live, reverse both pieces of the jobs housing piece, they're on time to work. They're less likely to miss work. We know there's a lot of good outcomes when people are able to live near work. They're more invested in their jobs. It's a win-win for many people. You have a different stake in the community when you're an employee, and a resident. Many of us in the room work in the community and live in the community, so it's a nice opportunity to feel that kind of investment in this community. I think Skokie has a good track record with that. Create new housing opportunities to increase Skokie's affordable housing supply. This is the discussion for inclusionary housing, which I'll sort of delay to the end, but also update our zoning code. We've had some feedback on the housing at skokie.org email to support ADUs, positive reception there. Utilize that land on properties for a small unit. People can age in place. They can have caretakers, in-laws, older children. Lots of different opportunities to add a rental unit, then to enhance revenue for their own household. ADUs just expand the ability for somebody to utilize their property while adding a housing unit that effectively doesn't cost anything to create other than the homeowner. Affordable housing demolition fee. We've had some discussion about this and some feedback looking at how when somebody takes a home, I'm thinking of that classic Skokie post World War II 3-bedroom, maybe 1.5 bath with a finished basement, and demos it and then builds a much bigger house. We lose that housing stock as that turns over. So looking at a fee associated with that could support some of the affordable housing work that's talked about here, but also recognizing that when you do charge that fee, some households may be looking to it. They're investing in their existing home, and they're trying to age and be part of this community. So making sure that we're not being punitive to people who want to do that, and looking at ways to assess that fee so it's targeting developers who might be coming in and doing that work and then leaving. So that is definitely a work in progress item. Underutilized parcels. We're doing some research right now through the sustainability plan to look at underutilized parcels, whether they're paved parcels with parking lots or lots that may not have the highest and best use on them. Look at those parcels and see if there's opportunities for other uses, and if they're zoned appropriately, that has a longer horizon, but that's a piece of that. And then support local and region-wide partner efforts to promote and expand fair housing efforts. We talked a bit about promoting Cook County's residential tenant landlord ordinance at our last meeting and making sure that we're pushing out that information, working with partners on making sure people have, both landlords and tenants, understand the rules. Okay, so take a brief pause and talk. There was a document in the packet of materials that talked about draft parameters for inclusionary housing. I'm going to go through those briefly, but effectively, this some of the things we talked about. This is I'm attempting throughout the last exercise that we had to try to get some feedback. So by no means is this set, but looking to start a conversation about some of what we're thinking about here. So looking at what other communities have done, the table that's in the packet that has links, and what other communities have done, tried to put together something for Skokie. So applicability, one thing I think we heard is we didn't want to put smaller developers, small landlords in a position of having to provide affordable units. So looking at economies of scale, so the proposed applicability was any new residential units containing 11 or more units. So that's 1 through 10 would be exempt from this. For sale or residential new construction projects with 11 or more units, and existing residential properties that are converted from condominiums to rental properties, or rental properties that are converted to condominiums, or other commercial properties that are renovated to include 11 or more units of residential housing. We've been seeing in the market office buildings converted to living spaces. That's a post-pandemic trend we're seeing, so looking at making sure that we're covering that as well. Requirement of on-site units. I think there's been some feedback of this is probably the biggest piece, so I'll just try to bite this one off right now. What percentage would we want to see in developments? So it ranges pretty widely around. We've seen developers here in Skokie start to agree to 5% at 100% of AMI, and then also 5% at 80% of AMI. So this scheme proposes 5% for developments containing 11 to 150 units, and 10% for developments containing 151 or more units. And then looking at splitting that AMI 50-50 between 60 and 80% of AMI, and that affordable units need to be a mix of all unit types that are offered throughout the building, and that they need to be the mix needs to be comparable to the mix of units. So if you have building that is spread across all studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, you can't just put all your affordable units in the studios. They have to be a mix of all the units offered. And then when a percentage is not a whole number, the number is rounded up to the next percentage. So if a 126 unit building, subject to the 5% on-site requirement, that is 6.3 units, the requirement would be 7 units on-site, not 6. And then I think the feedback has generally been not favorable to fee in lieu, but consideration that in some cases a fee in lieu may be appropriate if the on-site is not feasible. And so the example I think I've given a couple times is a developer of townhomes comes in and wants to develop townhomes. Those association fees, the HOA fees could price somebody out and not make that unit affordable in terms of maintaining that. So that is sort of where we landed. This is by no means what we're going to package up to the board, which brings us to next steps. We've been talking about this, and I think we've all acknowledged that this is a first step in a lot of work that's going to come over many years and be a bigger group project than just the Plan Commission. So staff's recommendation is to move this to the board so they can start to work on this and give this body and other bodies more direction.
So we're going to present findings that we have now to the board on the 17th and get feedback from them for future discussion? Okay, very good. Commissioners, do we have any questions or comments?
I do.
Yes, Commissioner Ross, Matei.
So a couple pieces that I wanted to cover. So Johanna wanted to understand that, right? 150 or less units were at 5, 151 plus at 10.
That's what we were contemplating.
And then
here.
the AMI was 60-80, 60 for the 5 and 80 for the 10.
A split either way. So 5%. So the 5%, you'd split 60. Half of those units would be 60, and half of those would be 80. And same thing for 10. Half would be 80, half would be 60.
Great. Question for what does a typical fee in lieu of look like? What's the structure of?
So it would, a couple different situations. It's a cash payment, or
Mhm.
effectively cash payment, that sometimes, depending on at what point the ordinance would determine it's due, when you obtain your permit fees, when you're seeking occupancy, any number of those things. But it's calculated. So if you did fee in lieu of the on-site units, so if you had to provide the 126 unit building that has to provide 5%, if it was 126 townhome development and they were supposed to provide 5%, which was 7 units then, and fee in lieu was determined to be appropriate, then the ordinance would have indicated what is the number that you, so if it's $2 or if it's $200,000, whatever the fee that is essentially it's a fee schedule of what you'd have to pay. That's
Is it a
what they would pay.
percentage of the project, or how does
It'd be
that?
treated as a per unit fee. So if you were supposed to provide 7 units, you'd have to 7 multiplied whatever the fee is.
Okay, and is that the builder's cost of what each unit is then? And
Not usually. I mean, the
so
fee.
it's a fixed fee?
Yeah, the fixed fee. It's not. So it's not something that's determined. It would be what the village would
Mhm.
determine.
Okay.
And this is always challenging because the amount you can't, whatever you would pick is likely not what it would cost to build a new unit of housing at that rate. So there's inherently a better financial deal to pay the fee in lieu than provide the on-site for the longer term nature of things. There's certainly challenge to that. I think you also, one thing that's built into some ordinances is also looking at where the property is. So some communities, if you're in the downtown or you're in an area that's transit rich, we inherently build in some additional value. So, if we're gonna just keep whole numbers, if the fee is $5 and in a more desirable area, transit rich area, an area with highway access, an area in whatever it is, you could consider different fee and lieu for different parts of an area.
Understood.
One point of information, just to highlight, the fee in lieu is also something that is typically only available to a cash-rich developer. It's not something that can be financed into a project and paid out that way. So it really is targeted to or restricted to a larger developer, a larger cash-rich developer who has the ability to effectively pay that out of pocket. So, and again, I think we're just talking about recommending that as a possible concept or consideration where other alternatives do not apply, correct?
I wanted to speak to the end use of fee in lieu, that once the fee in lieu is paid for those projects that are cash rich and do create some fee in lieu funds, we can use them not just to think of the large land banked project, but we can use them for a variety of things, such as subsidizing affordable units into another building that might be being built by a developer who isn't as cash rich or as financeable. And that then subsidy comes out of the fee in lieu from the other project to subsidize the affordable in the new project that isn't as well funded. So I think that is lacking in this one-page discussion that we're going to give to the board. So we should probably tell the board those kinds of things.
I also think that some of those funds should be allocated to help to maintain the affordable housing that we have already.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, if I may, I will highlight in our discussion last go-around, and I'm sure is memorialized in the notes, one of the points that was highlighted was the idea that to the extent that there are any fees or fines generated, that at least one of the concepts that was promoted, I believe it's in A, did sort of suggest and point to the idea that a fund could be created and established that would help to support, through modest grants, homeowners who would prefer to maintain their existing affordable, what we would consider to be affordable, traditionally affordable housing.
And specifically, that would be, say, a 2-flat or a 3-flat with an uninhabitable basement, granting money to be able to create the second ingress, egress, be able to make it a livable space, but agree then to have it at an affordable rate. That was my
Any other comments, questions?
I,
Commissioner Franklin,
I just have a question based on previous conversations as well, that again, the fee in lieu pot that might be generated could also be used to help a current homeowner make their home ADA accessible or repair a roof if necessary in a situation where that individual would not be able to otherwise afford to do that, correct?
The village has community development block grants that we have a home repair program, but as we know, those funds are limited from a value at a certain point. So certainly this helps do a lot. And I don't think I can recommend, without doing something with fee and lieu, you're not gonna be able to pay for some of the things that we've talked about in goal A, B, C, and D. It's not, we don't have that kind of money in the municipal government that other communities that are listed here may have access to. We don't have access to that in the village of Skokie.
In some cases, I believe Medicare or Medicaid will help pay for some of the things like ramps and stair lifts and things like that. Okay.
Johanna, to that point, both.
Mr. Schock has the floor.
Oh,
Oh, I just have the question about that affordable units. What is the minimum square foot for like a one bedroom?
It would be units. It wouldn't be, I mean, if a unit's a unit, if it's a studio, I mean, in terms of an on-site, it would be required to meet a minimum? Is that?
Right, I mean, for the developer, it's like minimum they have to have like, I mean, they cannot build a one bedroom for like 300 square foot. So is there any minimum that you suggest them to have it, like one bedroom has to be minimum between like 500 to 600 square foot? More than one bedroom, there should be like 600 square foot to 700 square foot. Is any minimum?
Sure. I mean, our codes dictate some of the size of things. You need to have a certain amount of space to distance from windows to walls and other, you can't rent a unit if you can't fit a bed in it and things of that nature. I also, there's also the contemplation if there's this idea of doing, instead of saying this will be unit 1A, 3D, and 2F will be the affordable units, not designating specific units in a building as the affordable units and having them float. So when somebody who leaves the affordable unit, who is renting at an affordable rate leaves, then they fill it with somebody, they can fill whatever available unit is. So it's not the developer. I mean, there is sometimes developers want to say, okay, the units on the ground floor at the back to the alley are, I can't rent them for as much, so I'll rent them. But from an equity lens, it's to put everybody at the same par of being able to rent, creates also less of a stigma in the building itself when people start to know those with the affordable units. So my recommendation would be to consider a floating, and then you don't run into that problem.
So my question, Johanna, is this sheet going to be expanded when given to the trustees? If we vote on this, are we voting on
We're not
everything?
voting on anything tonight.
Oh, I didn't know if we were voting on moving this
No,
toward the
We're
trustees.
just gonna present to the board some of our findings
I see.
and get their feedback, and
I
then
see.
come back maybe to us.
So some of this discussion that we're having tonight will
Yes.
be included in that presentation to the
Exactly.
board? Okay.
Anyone else? Okay. Yes, Mr. Matei.
two things that are just of interest. The $80,000 a year that the village receives in the Skokie Housing Rehabilitation Program and another $80,000 in the enhancement program. Is that, who funds that?
That's funded through our community development block grant. So that's the federal government's money.
It's federal government. Okay, good enough. And just a comment, I guess, and some concern related to the auxiliary building units. Is that something that the village really feels we have a potential for? The reason why I say it is the vast majority of our properties are 30 and 40-foot lots. Unless you're removing a garage, in most cases, and putting in an accessory unit, we don't have a plethora of large property, except maybe the Devonshire area, which likens itself to having larger lots. I don't see how that's even plausible.
Well, I think what they're trying to do is maybe adjust some of the building codes to allow people to live in a basement, basically. Provided
Well-
given some relief.
Well,
So-
I think it's both. The way this
Yeah.
is written, it indicates both, right? It's both a standalone separate entrance as well as modifying an existing home to accommodate sort of what you would call an in-law unit, right?
It's really a national trend.
I understand that, but I'm just saying from the Village of Skoki's perspective, the number of homes that sit on parcels big enough to build
Sure.
an accessory unit really isn't there.
No.
Right, and there may be some limitations, but it's interesting, there are some properties, and I was getting some feedback from somebody, I live in a home like this, where my front door is on the side and my back door is on the other side. So it almost lends itself to an interesting in-law unit where you don't have to go to the alley. In other communities where you do have that rear parcel, you effectively have to access your ADU from the alley, which when you don't have sidewalks, it makes, so I'm curious to see how this could shake out, because we have properties that might actually be better, what are called internal ADUs, that help somebody then age in place because they have this larger home that they can
And
give
I
access to in a safe way.
agree with that 100%. I have a small house on a large lot. So I'm 7 feet short of a double lot, tear it down, build 2 houses, which happened behind me twice. But as far as an accessory, what I think is an accessory built separate from the home, I don't see that being plausible. I know Evanston looked at it, but especially the east part of town, they have a much larger land parcel. So building a coach house would be more suitable in those situations.
Yeah, and in Evanston, we were starting to see more some of the internal ADUs and even just,
That makes sense.
yeah, moving a family member in, but still having that autonomy. It's,
Or even an attached unit, bumping out a back room or something.
so any zoning changes would come back to the plan commission to further review and discuss, so.
And to elaborate on what Russ was saying, in some communities, they are taking unattached garages, turning them into an ADU in a separate unit. It doesn't they don't build anything different. What it changes is the zoning requirement for parking, because the on-site parking could be accommodated in a driveway. Maybe not our best thought, but that is what is being done, with the garage being a separate dwelling unit. When there is no driveway separate from the unattached garage and the garage is accessed off the alley, then it pushes parking to the street, and then we get a whole parking issue of on-site versus not on-site, taking a property that was previously on-site parking and changing it to a not on-site parking property.
Oh, thank you. Any other comments, questions? All right, at this time, I'll open up the discussion to anyone in the audience who has a question or comment. Please come up, and again, please speak into the microphone and maybe take off your mask. Maybe you'll be more audible.
Hi, my name is Lauren Grodnicki. I can't take off my mask for health reasons, but
Okay.
I would like to give some context in terms of the environmental sustainability plan and these accessory dwellings. The conversations that we had in the land use and housing subgroup that drafted that chapter were specifically thinking about accessory dwelling units over a garage. So we're not tearing down the garage, we're just building another level on the garage, which right now has limits as to how high you can have it. So that was one of the things we were talking about. Just wanted to clarify that. And then as far as demo fees, somebody mentioned tearing down a smaller house and building a much bigger one. What I see are they tear down 2 houses and build a McMansion. Some of these, I've been inside a couple of them. One of them even had a fish tank built into the wall. So this has nothing to do with aging in place, and has everything to do with just like.
Well, no, those properties that's a different subject.
Right, so I think that for something like that, the demolition fee needs to be very high. And then in terms of the fee in lieu, I don't really understand how that would work, but whatever we do, we should try to make sure that we're not saying, hey, if you feel like paying for this convenience here, you can go pay for this convenience and it's the cost of doing business. Look at what happened with the Norfolk train line, right? I mean, they wrote that off as like, oh, well, willing to risk this huge thing, and it's going to be very expensive down the line, but it doesn't happen that often. It's just the cost of doing business. So it should be prohibitively expensive if we do fee in lieu, just to make sure that it's not something that, as you said, cash-rich developers can just throw out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else, please? Good evening.
Good evening. Hi. Gail Schechter, 9033B Keating for Skokie Neighbors for Housing Justice. And thank you for this process. The goals look great. And I just wanted to ask if maybe at the end of this part of the agenda, if you can speak to the public comment that you've gotten and how you've incorporated or the feedback through because we don't know how much you received and how much you incorporated. It seems like a lot of it was. But I want to speak on behalf of our group, especially about the inclusionary zoning proposals. So if I can, I don't know if I need to be sworn in, but I just wanted to read our...
Only if you're going to give us data and facts. If it's a comment,
actually, there is some data in
well,
here.
then, just to be on the safe side, I'll swear you
Okay.
in. Okay. Do you affirm that the testimony you give tonight is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth to help you?
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to read our statement here. Getting by as an older person on a fixed income or working as a preschool teacher, store clerk, cab driver, waiter, artist, or nurse, nearly 1 in 3 Skokie households brings home under $50,000 a year. And of these 7,000 families, almost all, or about 80%, are spending more than they can afford to live here. These families are sacrificing food, clothing, or medicine, or they're packing their bags and leaving, as 3,000 of them did over the past 20 years. Skokie used to be home to nearly 10,000 families at this income level, or 43% of our town. So now we're at 30%. So we're saddened and alarmed that the Skokie that welcomes everyone is turning into a Skokie that welcomes only the everyone's at earning over $90,000 in income. In authorizing the drafting of an affordable housing policy, it would seem that the board indicates that it wants to stop the exodus and allow these under $95,000 families to thrive in Skokie. But what are we seeing being brought to the table here? So what we have before us is an inclusionary housing proposal which would help actually none of these families. So this is not acceptable to us. This is actually lower performing than any of the communities in the table that was provided in your packets. The draft inclusionary housing policy is tantamount to a declaration of what we feel is non-responsibility by the village because it ignores the fixed, moderate, and low-income residents as well as the roles they play in the economy. So because affordable housing development is economic development, as Johanna mentioned, when you live close to work, it's good for the economy. When we have a workforce, again, that lives near their jobs, we have a healthy producer and consumer economy, we have a more engaged electorate of people who have set down roots here, people whose housing is stable, affordable, and well-maintained contribute to making a town welcoming. People whose housing is stable, affordable, and well-maintained are able to use that as a stepping stone to saving, investing, consuming, and improving a community's quality of life. So our Skokie Neighbors for Housing Justice, a grassroots group of Skokie residents, reiterates our call for a unified housing policy which meets human needs and promotes community. We outlined options and examples in our memo. So these are what we would like to see in inclusionary housing ordinance. That each new development is right-sized for the neighborhood, meaning that it would not be so large as to that an influx of new expensive housing would displace neighbors. 2, that it promotes new development for families with children, not just upwardly mobile professionals, empty nesters, or the wealthy. Requires a net of at least 30%, because again, 30% of our community earns under $50,000, 30% of units in new multifamily developments to be affordable to lower income households. Allows for affordability within that 30% set aside for a full range of low to moderate, maybe from 30% of AMI up to 100% of AMI, but a range. makes the below market rates units affordable in perpetuity to serve as a stepping stone for future generations, not sunset after 30 years, and mandates that developers engage in affirmative marketing to people of all backgrounds. This ordinance should be drafted and approved immediately so that all developers are formally notified, including Westfield, that they will have to prepare accordingly if they want to build in Skokie and obtain variances. And then we reiterate the other 2 points we mentioned at the last meeting. We would like to see a proactive, empowered housing commission, because that wasn't listed here, with the authority to review and evaluate new housing, because housing is a different animal than other things that you see before the Plan Commission. And also the Housing Commission would be charged with reviewing housing needs every year. And then the second is to create a unified housing plan informed by a survey of needs, which I know was discussed. So finally, without a coherent public policy overseeing housing in Skokie, the village will continue its current trajectory with an increasing influx of small and well-off households, rising rents, and a continued exodus of middle and lower income families. This is neither fair nor humane, nor does it have Skokie's long-term community and economic development interests at heart. So I appreciate we appreciate this start, but just so you know, I mean, even the state of Illinois has 15% as a minimum set aside. So thank you.
Okay, thank
And I
you.
have copies of this
Okay.
too.
Well, if you give us a copy, we'll put it on our record.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi everyone, I'm Max Seeley with Joining Forces for Affordable Housing. We are a program based out of Connections for the Homeless, which is based in Evanston but serves...
Do you have an address for that?
Yeah, it
organization?
is 2121 Dewey Avenue in Evanston, but we serve many North Suburban Cook County communities, including Skokie. I first off want to commend the village of Skokie for taking the step to think about and move towards enacting inclusionary housing ordinance. In addition to being an organizer with Connections to the Homeless, I'm also a graduate student in applied community and economic development at Illinois State University, and my capstone project is on inclusionary housing ordinances. And from that research, the academic research in inclusionary housing shows that the most successful inclusionary housing ordinances, what the components that have is, one, just time passing an inclusionary housing ordinance leads to more inclusionary units being created. That one's, kind of a no-brainer, but it's in there. And then, other factors in that is having the inclusionary housing ordinance be mandatory. I think a good example of that is Evanston's inclusionary housing ordinance, where even with the fee in lieu, there's still that 5% set aside requirement. And I think that is a good model that the village of Skokie should look at as they go forward. Additionally, good inclusionary housing ordinances cover the entire municipality, which I believe Skokie is moving towards, and also has complex income requirements, which with the half 60% AMI, half 80% AMI, this proposal does accomplish. So I would urge that the village of Skokie moves closer to that 10%, 20% range, and, even, possibly looking up to that 30% range that Gail mentioned. But we just want to commend the village of Skokie for taking this first step, which is a good, strong first step in an overall policy goal of including more affordable units in Skokie, because the people that need inclusionary units already live in Skokie and are housing cost burdened. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. By the way, there is a sign-up sheet there on the desk there. If you give us your name and address or email, we'll notify you when these hearings are and when this will go before the board. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Shelley Pat. I live at 4235 Payne Street. And I also just want to thank this commission for taking up this really important issue. And it is really, I'm feeling very hopeful hearing so many voices recognizing that the lack of affordable housing is a problem in Skokie. But I'm also concerned, just as I had mentioned in a comment at a previous meeting, the conversation shifting towards single-family homeowners. You know, many of the things that were discussed that seem to get the strongest excitement and reaction from this commission are things that are going to help people who are lucky and privileged enough to own their own homes already. Like, aging in place is a wonderful idea. I live in a single-family ranch house in Skokie that I've lived in for 21 years. I hope to still be there in another 20 or 30 years, but that's because I own my own house. For someone who is an elderly person in Skokie who is renting and seeing rents go up and up and up, when they become disabled, there is zero housing they can live in. And aside from these new luxury developments that cost way more than they can afford. And all of the people working in Skokie, and again, you know, these were Gale statistics, but again, the faces on these people, the people making $15 to $18 an hour, serving food at Culver's, bussing tables at all of the wonderful restaurants that Westfield is going to bring in, the people, the janitors at the hospital, and the people who work for the Village of Skokie themselves, the teachers at the Top Learning Center, the instructors at Fitness First, none of them make enough money to live in these new developments. And so my concern about fee in lieu is fee in lieu, as Mr. Berman brought up, fee in lieu that will actually go to subsidize other units could help these people. But fee in lieu that is just simply going to go to fix up units that already exist doesn't create more affordable housing. And so I'd really encourage whatever this commission is going to recommend, make sure that it's with the intention of being able to create new units that will actually help the people in Skokie, not just people who are living in Skokie now, but the many people working in Skokie who would, as Johanna had mentioned, like to live near their jobs, or other people who will just come to Skokie and help continuing to create this welcoming community. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
John J.J. Avaska from 8909 Forest View Road. Again, thank you very much. I really appreciate seeing Goal D in the draft plan. I'd like to suggest that it could be strengthened by having an actual sort of ballpark range of how many units we think need to be added to the supply. Obviously, I realize that can be very difficult to generate, but I think working towards some type of quantitative target would be helpful for Goal D. And related to that would be with the inclusionary ordinance included as the top option for achieving Goal D, I think it would be helpful to get some type of rough ballpark estimate of how many affordable units we think will be generated by the ordinance as currently written. How big of a contribution will that ordinance make towards the overall goal of Goal D? If it's not going to be substantial, if perhaps it's not aggressive enough in terms of incentivizing affordable housing, we're going to need some of the other options in the strategy to really be have more investment or even have additional options on the table to achieve that target for Goal D. I understand that the Plan Commission heard from some developers earlier in the listening sessions who actually don't need to have their arms twisted to build affordable units, but are actually eager to do that. I believe one of them was HODC, who if I'm not mistaken, have launched a 44-unit, all affordable housing unit project in Evanston on Church Avenue or Church Street. And so I would hope to see that as being part of the strategy as well, not just twisting arms of reluctant developers, but also encouraging and doing proactive outreach to those who want to be building affordable units. I'd also like to see the comment about zoning relaxed for ADUs. I'm really excited to see that. To be honest, my parents, who are in their 70s, are in a condo in Skokie, not 4 blocks away from me. I would say probably within 10 years, we'll be looking to convert our garage into an ADU. So I think there are people like me out there. But I would also hope to see the zoning relaxed to also allow the development of 2 or 3 flats in what are currently single-family only neighborhoods. These are very much in character with Skokie, and they do allow options that don't rely on Skokie Village funds, but allow all of us to contribute towards these goals of affordable housing and making Skokie a more resilient community. So again, thank you very much, and appreciate the listening sessions you've had.
Thank you.
Good evening, Charlie Sachs, 7400 block at Tripp. I had a quick question. There was a thing on the agenda about drive-throughs tonight that wasn't talked about.
That's a discussion for later.
Okay, cool. I wanted to reinforce what's been said about ADUs. For many years, I've considered lofting my garage specifically for a workspace, not necessarily a dwelling unit, but a workspace. And I think that would be really, really helpful, especially these days when we have more work-from-home situations, and effectively we're losing bedrooms as people convert their spaces from a bedroom to an office. And if you run the numbers on it, it could potentially be pretty significant. And also, again, reinforcing what's been commented about revising the zoning, I think to look at the current situation within the context of existing zoning would be too restrictive. I think we need to modify the zoning, and also not just the height limitations on garages, but also the parking requirements. If you walk down the alley, at least when I walk down the alleys, and I do that just to walk around, currently, I would say anecdotally, roughly less than half of the garage spaces are actually used for storing cars. Many of them are already converted to workspaces or fitness spaces or workshops, or a lot of it is storage because people are using all the bedrooms for multi-generational households. And the other thing is with the pandemic and with the change and everything, the housing market and the building market is very dynamic. Joanna mentioned the conversion of office spaces to residential spaces. I think it's really important for Skokie to stay ahead of this, that we have a housing commission that really is tasked with monitoring and studying these kind of things and understanding these dynamics. So rather than being in a situation where we're reacting to circumstances that we're not familiar with or we don't have a good handle on, that we can get ahead of the game, and also looking at the feasibility of a community land trust. The Housing Commission could help guide that whole process too, and not just respond to opportunities that might come up, but actually proactively create opportunities to come up. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? Okay, so as a reminder, we will be bringing these issues before the board at the April 17th meeting. That's a Monday night, and they meet at 7:30. Okay, without further ado, on to our next agenda item. Yes? Oh, okay. I guess I should entertain a vote to approve this as a package to be presented to the board. Not to make it an ordinance, but to present it to the board, so.
For clarification, Paul, we're
Yes.
not recommending that the board then vote this in as an
No.
ordinance. We're simply saying this is our preliminary presentation of information that they then should then give back to us
Right.
for more discussion.
Yes, okay. Who wants to make a motion?
Motion to approve
Okay.
the recommendations and the assorted collected public comments to be presented to the board for their consideration
At their April 17th meeting.
at the April 17th meeting with regard to the issue of affordable housing in Skokie.
Okay, do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Manchella. Call for the vote. Any comments on the vote? On the motion? No comments? Okay. Commissioner Osley,
Aye.
Commissioner Manchella,
Aye.
Commissioner Scott Berman,
Aye.
Commissioner Franklin,
Aye.
Commissioner Shaw,
Yes.
Commissioner Ross Matei. Yes. And I'll vote yes. So, we're all in agreement on the issues that the staff has presented, and we'll move forward to have the board look at these and give us more guidance. Okay, thank you. Moving on, our next discussion is a discussion of potential policy changes to address and mitigate the impact of drive-throughs. And Paul, if you'll give us your report.
Yeah, great. Thanks. For the record, Paul Reese on the staff for the village. And as mentioned, I'd like to kind of begin a discussion and get some feedback from the commission on potential zoning changes and some policy guidelines that we're thinking about initiating for permitting and mitigating drive-through uses. So as everyone knows, COVID kind of did a number on restaurants. In-person eating wasn't allowed for a couple years, and so a lot of restaurants transitioned to drive-throughs. And so some of the research that I've found has shown that even coming out of COVID, up to 75% of fast food restaurant sales are still going through the drive-through. And just kind of anecdotally, a lot of, the village has been getting a lot of calls recently on restaurants and other drive-through uses, what zoning they require, what places that they can go. And so it's obviously a conversation that we need to have, and specifically because the environmental plan that was adopted recently talks a lot about, reducing vehicle miles traveled, reducing CO2, reducing waste, increasing the tree canopy, increasing walkability. We thought this was a good time to kind of bring this up in that context. So I will kind of just give a little bit of background from the memo, and then talk about a couple things that I'd like to get some feedback and conversation on. So as I mentioned, up to 75% of sales from fast food restaurants are through the drive-through. And one study that I found showed that the average drive-through time is around 6 minutes. And while that's less than it was during COVID, it's still higher than the pre-COVID times. And everyone knows that idling for longer periods does increase the carbon dioxide and other emissions. And a study out of the Argonne National Laboratory, which is in the packet, shows that idling more than 10 seconds uses more fuel and emits more emissions than if you turn your car off and restart it. I did a little bit of research of the current context of drive-throughs here in Skokie, and since 2002, there's been 26 new restaurants, and of those, 5 have included drive-throughs. Now, that doesn't include the other drive-through use types like ATMs and banks and car washes and et cetera. And yeah, that's right. And so, the village already kind of regulates where the drive-throughs can locate. Right in our zoning code, there's only a couple districts where drive-throughs are allowed. And then we have an overlay called retail streets, where further limits how those drive-throughs, so restaurants aren't allowed in those, and any drive-through in a retail street needs to share the driving space and not be visible from the retail street. And so I guess what I'd like to do is kind of mention a couple ways that we can mitigate some of these impacts and get some direction from the commission. So there's two of the impacts that I'd like to talk about. One is the emissions and one is vehicular impact. So in our zoning code, currently, there's a net floor area that requires an amount of parking. So for example, a 2,000 square foot restaurant is required to provide 20 parking spaces. And so one idea is to decrease that requirement. So if, for example, instead of one parking space for 100 square feet, it would be 150 square feet. And that would kind of give us a little bit more flexibility in the site plan. And given the fact that a lot of these restaurants are already asking for that kind of input, so they can use some of the site plan for more drive-through space instead of more parking space, something to consider. Ideally, it would be great if that reduced space for parking could be used for kind of tree coverage or outdoor dining or other amenities. Another way to kind of restrict the location of drive-throughs would be to tweak the zoning to remove the drive-through uses from mixed-use districts or near transit. So as I mentioned, in mixed-use districts, they're allowed, but must not be visible from the street. So one potential thing would be to remove entirely the allowing drive-throughs in those types of districts, downtown specifically. And then another way to kind of manage some of the vehicular impact would be to create some conditions that that we require in the special use permits. So a couple of those ideas would be to require a plan to be on record with the village to address how the operations are managed, so specifically the queuing lines, and what to do if they underestimate their queuing estimates from their traffic impact study, and how they'll handle the impact on the roadways. Another thing would be to require them to prohibit deliveries during peak usage time, and then a third would be to require mobile ordering as a way to potentially get people out of their cars and actually go inside and limit their emissions in that way. And then finally, I have a couple policy potentials changes for the emissions impacts. So a couple things that are up for discussion are to consider requiring restaurants to offer composting and recycling in addition to their normal waste hauling. And then the last one would be to require some additional tree coverage, either on-site or as a fee in lieu, that could be tied to the number of cars that are generated in their traffic studies. So as I mentioned, a lot of these kind of topics and policies were pulled directly from the environmental sustainability plan. So with that, I'll kind of open it up to discussion and take some direction from the commission.
I have a question, like in an instance where we recently approved 2 drive-through uses basically in the same parcel. You know, they're like one across from each other and on the same lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that there's space there for a third. So now we're gonna have 3 drive-throughs in one parcel. Is there any, what do you feel about that? Do you think we could limit the number of drive-throughs by a square footage or something?
I don't think square footage would be the way to do it. I mean, I think a big kind of determining factor on that is the kind of impact. So all these require a special use, and all those require the developer to provide a traffic impact study. And so I think that kind of speaks to, you know, what would work and what would fit and what would be too much for any particular parcel to handle.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Commissioner Berman?
Well, you raised a problem that I'm not sure we have, where you said, what happens to the excess cars that go beyond the stack lines that were planned?
Mm-hmm.
And in my recent memory of those stack lines that were planned, they were then planned for excess on site. I'm thinking of Chick-fil-A,
Sure.
I'm thinking of Waterways Car Wash. Each of them, and Culver's, each of them said that if they did exceed what we had allowed, that it would then stack back into their parking lot. detrimental for them
Right.
and for the world, but not backing up onto a street. So when you suggested that we won't allow them to stack up on a street, I don't think we have
Yeah,
for many years.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I don't think I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't allow them. I think we should, one, make sure that they're accurate in their accounting for that, and then two, have on record what their plan would be if they did, like you said, they would. The examples you gave, their plan would be to put it into their parking. It would be detrimental to them and not on the street. So just to kind of put that in writing and get it in paper during the agreement and negotiating piece, not after the fact.
Commissioner Berman, I think it also, I am not a lawyer and I'm not going to pretend to be one, but I think it also gives us ability to deal with this from an administrative hearing standpoint, where if they're in violation of what they have represented to us, they are not in conformance. So if they say they can manage all their on-site traffic and they're going to show us how they're, I dealt with a property in my previous community that I worked in that constantly stacked into the street, and it was detrimental to the intersection. It created unsafe. It was horrible, and I will carry that experience with me for a very long time. But they established a plan that effectively they would, if the line got too long, they would move people through, and they did that through not collecting payment for the drive-through. That was their sort of nuclear option. You can all ask me where this place is, this special place is that gives free drinks if it gets too busy. But that was the plan. So I think looking to make sure, and again, in my experience, when you ask, often the person who's giving you the site plan isn't necessarily the restaurant operator.
Yeah.
And so marrying those two things up, they know the specs are they need to queue up for X number of cars in order to make their, but we know as the community here, the dynamics of how streets work. Somebody in another location, different time zone, doesn't know how our streets work. So that's why these come for a special use. And then there's also the issue of cumulative impact. Again, we are empowered to make the decision. There are 2 drive-throughs here. A third one is not appropriate. There's too much of negative cumulative impact, and that's where I think we can start to link the environment and sustainability issues and emissions and other things that we can mitigate as a community through our zoning code.
Well, so I have a comment and then a question. One is it's a matter of my personal preference. I think the increased tree cover should be a requirement, period, full stop, for every drive-through, and I think that requirement should be accelerated and exaggerated where their request is extraordinary. I would also suggest that, and this is the question, I suppose, whether or not there's been any consideration given to secondary or tertiary access or communication ports for ordering and physical access for the servicing of the food or whatever is being provided at that drive-through. Meaning that the queuing is such that if you have 24 vehicles or whatever has been approved, but they're all single file, that's a lot different than if they're broken up in 2 or 3 or potentially even 4 lanes. So just curious as to whether or not there's been any consideration to the multiplicity of the ordering, payment, and servicing mechanism, as well as the queuing.
Yeah, good. That's a great point, and I have seen that in a lot of the literature and a lot of planning places in other locations in other cities. I haven't run across it yet in Skokie, come across our desk, but I think it's a good consideration to see what the impacts of that would be, and to study that a little further if that does kind of reduce the time and or reduce the kind of square footage needed for parking, and maybe it opens up some space for trees and other amenities.
Okay. One more thing. That's about on-site parking to relative square footage. When we change that too much, obviously we get neighbor complaints, even up front. I'm thinking of the Oberweis store that opened up many years ago, and the neighbors were quite concerned because it is next to a residential street, both Skokie Boulevard and around the corner and Nile Center, and they wanted to make sure there was enough parking on site that overflow parking didn't impact them. And others like that are concerned about the on-site parking to the square footage, that we don't want to tinker with too much. I'm a little concerned when you suggest that we do it for environmental reasons is a very good reason. On the other hand, not if we're going to impact parking on the surrounding streets.
No, duly noted, and...
Oh, I'm sorry, one more.
Yeah, sorry.
Pizza Inn, when they were building the Pizza Palace, and same concern,
Sure.
adjacent to a residential street, and the neighbors were quite concerned that they have adequate parking on site.
Can I offer a counterpoint to that?
Yeah, sure.
So I mean, I would just like to say, I think that if you add additional parking, that's a permanent structure. That's water that's not being absorbed. If you're taking green space away, if it's only to accommodate overflow that happens, you know, on the 4th of July when somebody sells a lot of ice cream, for example, right? So if it's not an everyday condition, I don't know if we should be factoring in additional parking for that. And I can say that as somebody who lives very close to a park. And so when there's a softball game, there's no parking within 2 miles of the park. But that doesn't mean that there should be a parking lot built for that park for the handful of occasions when girls softball is happening. You get my point?
Mm-hmm. Very good. Okay. All right. Paul, does that conclude your presentation, or do you have anything else to provide?
I don't have anything else. Thanks
Okay.
for the conversation.
All right,
Comments?
thank you, and I will entertain any comments from the floor. Yes. Yeah. Who has a question? You have a presentation, yes. Okay.
I'm gonna need help. And
You got it?
no,
Do you know which one it is?
that one.
This one? And you can just...
I was hoping to be able to present this before the conversation went any further because you're specifically addressing trees and how that could offset. So here are my sources, and I can send this to you so that you have it, you know, without having to write it all down. Here are some of the constants and conversion factors and assumptions that I made. I made an assumption of 5 minutes of idling. Someone said that one of the other restaurants says it's 6 minutes. Chick-fil-A insists it's no more than 3.5, although they have a different business model because they have warmers apparently, and that's different than having to make your food. I don't know, I looked at Chick-fil-A's menu and I was like, oh, people eat there? Sorry. So anyway, for the best case scenario, right, not all trees sequester the same amount of carbon dioxide per year. And the calculations that I did are for a certain number of cars idling for a certain number of time, assuming that's every day of the year, and then the trees are absorbing over the course of a year, right? So I just want to make sure that's clear. For the best case scenario, fuel use is only 0.2 gallons per hour of idling, and there's a range you'll see on the next slide. And the most sequestering trees will sequester 40 kilograms of carbon dioxide a year. And so for the minimum value of emissions and the maximum values of carbon dioxide sequestration per tree, idling for 5 minutes would produce this amount of carbon dioxide just for one car for 5 minutes. Now Jollibee, which I think they just made up that number, but said they have 150 cars come, and let's say that's every day for 1 year, it would produce that much CO2. Oh yeah, you have a laser pointer. This is how many kilograms of CO2 are produced. In order to offset that by trees, you need almost 200 trees just for this 150 cars. Now imagine that instead you had a less efficient car, so you're burning half a gallon an hour just from idling, and the tree doesn't sequester as much carbon. So here you have 5 minutes of idling, and you end up needing almost 1,000 trees. So I don't think planting trees is enough really to offset the emissions. So now here, Wendy's says that they had 800 cars come through in a day. And their best case scenario with the most efficient cars and the most sequestering trees, they still need almost 450 trees to offset their emissions from this drive-through. So where are these trees going to go? I mean, presumably they're going on village property, but I think the parkways are already accounted for in the sustainability plan, because finding places for those 15 acres of trees every year that need to be planted for the next 7 years, I think, a lot of that land is taken up. The park district probably isn't going to complain about companies paying to plant trees in the parks, right? There's plenty of park space that could have trees. But, I mean, I live next to Devonshire Park, and I can see maybe 30 to 50 trees being planted there. That doesn't even cover Jollibee. So then I have one suggestion to partially mitigate the problem, because it's not just CO2 emissions that come out from idling. It's all sorts of carcinogenic chemicals, and this is according to the EPA. And it increases the cancer risk for the person inside the car, because that air is being brought into the car, whether you've got your AC running or you've got your heater on. It's going to the surrounding neighborhoods. The people who are working in the drive-thru are constantly breathing this stuff in. So idling is just generally terrible. What if we surround the drive-thrus with conifers, which are only going to maybe offset, you can get maybe 15 trees, but at least you're forcing that air to stay in there and only poison the drivers who are idling. So the remaining trees, where are that going to go? You can't even put them all in the parking lot, which part of the plan called for putting more trees in parking lots to create shade and reduce the urban heat island effect, which is very bad in parking lots. So if the trees shade, sorry, do people need cough drops? There's this like chorus of coughing. I have some cough drops to go around. No, we're good? Okay. If the trees shade the building, now you're offsetting the number of trees you need a little bit, because you're also reducing the emissions from your cooling costs in the summer. That was part of some of the stuff that's on the sources that I have on the first page, but I did come up with an alternative to drive-thrus. You can have drive-ups. A lot of restaurants during the pandemic did not have a drive-thru, but what you did was you ordered on the app, and then when you got to the restaurant, you told them which spot you were in, and they came and they brought your food. So if we had something like that, and we had signs that said no idling, and the app also said, please, for the health of our servers, do not have your car running when we come out there, that would go a long way toward offsetting this instead of having drive-thrus. Examples that did this are Starbucks on Karlov and Dempster, the Olive Garden, and the Red Lobster that are on Toohey and McCormick. All did this. So then, right, you have these drive-ups where I grew up with stories of people on roller skates coming out to bring you your food, right? But this is a restaurant that still exists, and you can have this sign, right? You drive up here.
Is it really there?
I don't know where this place is, actually.
It's in Wheeling.
Oh, okay. I just Googled it, and next thing you know.
By the way,
I own Super.
he owns it.
Both in Chicago and Wheeling, and the speaker system has since been upgraded. It's even prettier now. So.
Okay, so you could have a sign here
Yeah,
that said
we're-
no idling for this health of everybody around you, including the person who's bringing you your food, so you don't have to get out of your car.
We actually do tell people that.
I only
So
mentioned
there
it.
you go, right? We don't
I-
need drive-thrus. You can have this.
I'm
And look, you're not
mentioning
even getting wet.
I'm mentioning his ownership for full transparency here.
No, I'm glad that you told me that. I had no idea that. Yes.
No problem.
Okay. Okay. Anyway.
Yes, you're right. It is a more efficient system to have this kind of a delivery system than drive-through window.
And it takes up a lot less space. Okay, so then here's just another one. This, to me, it does not look like a vintage picture, even though you have a lot of very old cars. But this guy, you can't see it so clearly on here, but he does not look to me like he's wearing 1950s clothing. So, anyway. Another part of this is we could change the culture in Skokie. Because this idea of, oh, it's faster, it's more convenient to just drive up to a window, order my food, drive up to the next window, or drive up to the microphone, order my food, drive up to the window, get my food. I don't have to get out of the car. But is it really any faster? I don't think it's any faster. So if we encourage people to just take a deep breath, look at things realistically, and get out of your car, right? Now all of a sudden you have to go stretch your legs. And a lot of the food that we're talking about is really bad for you anyway. It's much better that you get out of your car and walk. No offense to the super dog.
People are lazy. That's a fact.
Right. So again, changing the culture, right? We can have this messaging and change the culture. So in the drive-thru, you're stuck there, right? You have to wait until all of the people in front of you get out of your way. But if you get up and you walk into the restaurant, all you wanted was a milkshake, frequently you walk out before the 3 people in front of you. So in summary, there are alternatives to drive-thrus, and we can work on changing mindsets. And we need to figure out where these places are going to put their trees, because again, depending on which trees you put in, Wendy's has to put in almost 5,000 trees. That's one drive-through. And it's also not taking into account the toxins, and it's not taking into account the particulates.
Can I ask a question about your calculations?
Yep.
I'm just curious as to whether or not you factored in reduced or zero emissions vehicles.
I did not. Because this was a lot of times, first of all, there's no way to figure out, like the drive-thrus don't have information about how many of those cars there are. And every time you inch up, your car turns back on. Like if you're talking about the ones that turn themselves off, right? So the mayor and Trustee Klein have both brought up, like, I have that kind of a car. But, and I even see
They're
people.
not effectively idling, though.
They kind of are. So I bike most of the time, and I can hear when the car turns on and off.
Yes,
and I'll
they
see somebody
turn on and off repetitively, but they don't actually idle. That's the only reason why I asked the
What do
question.
you mean they don't idle? They don't turn off immediately. And
They
people
do.
at a red light will drive up, they'll turn
They-
on the engine, inch up, and then it's still like many seconds before it turns back off.
Well, that's if a person actively takes their foot off the brake. If their foot's on the brake, it turns off, and it stays off
Yeah,
until
the
they
car
take
will,
their
the
foot
car
off the
will
brake.
turn off. Now,
So if they're-
hybrids.
So every
Hybrids-
time,
Well,
wait,
and
so
that
are
doesn't
you
speak to
saying
the
that,
electric vehicles.
right, it doesn't speak to the electric vehicles, but are you saying that every time you come to a stop sign, your engine turns off?
Yes.
Cars with those features, yes.
Okay.
Again, your point still stands, right? We're
Right.
still talking about a significant number of trees. There's no question. I was just asking if that was part of the
Right,
calculation.
I did not have any way to incorporate that.
Understood.
And as we go forward, there are going to be more and more electric vehicles, and this will become this particular aspect of the drive-throughs will become less of an issue.
I enjoyed your presentation, of course, mentioning Superdog. My question with your numbers is that the number of cars per day is possibly accurate, although Wendy's is not accurate at all. Chick-fil-A is definitely accurate.
They went back in the back and like put me on hold for 5 minutes to go
That's
find the numbers. I
not
believe
correct,
them.
but doesn't, that is what I was questioning. The fact of the 5-minute idle, that does occur at peak times, but as in Jollibee's case, which was accurate numbers also, not all those times are peak times where they have the 5-minute idle. Now, there are some 10-minute idle times at Portillo's, and there are some 0 or 1 minute where you just drive up and drive through. Seldom at Portillo's, but definitely at Jollibee.
So here I have
Oh.
to answer.
For 1.5 minutes of idle.
For
Then-
this
so-
for every 4
okay.
minutes of
I just
idle.
wanted to mention that we can't take all of those numbers and multiply them by 5 or 6 or 7 minutes of idle.
Right. It would have to be like, figure out how the actual one
But
works.
otherwise, you're correct. It's terrible to idle at a drive-in or at a drive-through, and it does create a lot of pollution.
Right, and again, I said, I was very clear that it's an assumption, right? So these numbers will change a little bit depending on how long people are idling.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity
Yes.
to make this presentation.
Thanks. Yeah, I think Lauren touched on some of the adverse impacts, of the drive-throughs, and I think there are others as well. It's not just the emissions and pollution, but drive-throughs generate a lot more traffic. There's diminished pedestrian safety and walkability. There's a generation and distribution of litter that happens, use of single-use plastics and other materials, and distracted driving. And there's a lot of things about drive-throughs that if you live near them or in close proximity, and I don't live right next to a drive-through, but I live in close proximity to a drive-through, and it really is very unpleasant, and it adversely impacts the quality of life in the community. But I want to speak to, I think a lot of times drive-throughs are justified in part because of the very strong proprietary interest of restaurants in terms of doing business. And then frequently in Skokie, the drive-throughs are cited as economic development successes. I want to speak to the economics of the drive-throughs, particularly in terms of the economics for the municipality and for the community. For municipalities, and it's been studied and documented in other communities around the country, that drive-throughs and auto-oriented development generally is not good, and is not a good economic deal for a municipality. Due to the space required for drive-through facility to accommodate customers in their cars, in other words, displacing foot traffic with car traffic, the economic performance of the facility relative to the real estate required is very poor. The economic performance of drive-through and auto-oriented developments in Skokie are consistent with the experience studied in other communities. One of the measures of economic development success is the generation of property taxes. And I know this is complicated, and also there's sales taxes involved as well. But using property tax as an indicator of economic performance, I think, is fair. An analysis of property tax data comparing a new adaptive reuse of property along Skokie Boulevard with an older struggling commercial block on Main Street, and this is an example. There's the Skokie Point, which whereas there was a hotel and a car repair facility, was raised, and some new. There are 3 drive-through facilities that I think on there, as well as some other auto-oriented developments. Property tax rates generated per acre of land among that Skokie Boulevard, the Skokie Point, as compared to Main Street, an older, struggling area, are considerably less per acre than the older Main Street development. At Skokie Point, the new establishments generated property tax revenue at a rate of $144,000 per acre in 2021. On the 4,000 block of Main Street shown there, the property tax generated was $185,000 per acre. That's a 28% difference. At the last planning meeting, Paul Luke pointed out that Skokie is a community that's a built-out community that presents challenges for new development. As such, for Skokie to promote economic development and growth, it is imperative that Skokie optimize the economic performance of the real estate that is available. As the evidence clearly shows, building commercial developments based on drive-through facilities does not do that. In fact, it does the opposite. For the benefit of the economic and environmental sustainability and general quality of life in our community, the questions we need to ask is not how to do drive-throughs, but whether we should be doing them at all. And this conversation should be informed by a thorough evaluation of the economic benefits and the development for the community, and not merely the proprietary interests of the petitioner. Our evaluation of these developments should be predicated on optimizing the value of real estate that is available for regenerative reuse and creating a stronger and more valuable sense of place. I think we need to ask a very simple question. I keep asking a simple question: is what are we trying to build here? A good place to be, or a convenient town to drive through? So I think we need to focus on building a better place to be and not merely a convenient town to drive through. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in the audience? No, thank you for all your comments and questions. We're going to entertain a new portion of our Plan Commission meeting, and that I will take any comments or questions that are not on our agenda tonight. So does anybody have any concerns or questions? Yes?
I had one thing that I wanted to add about merging the affordable housing conversation with the sustainability conversation, which is that the amount of money that you can afford to spend on your housing is predicated on assumptions about how much you have to spend to heat and cool your housing. So if you lived in a passive house structure, that amount would be practically zero. So I just want to put that out there. That is yet another reason to insist that developers build passive house, or at least give them some type of incentive to build passive house.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Okay. Commissioners, any closing comments? Okay. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you for coming.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Because
Which one? Sorry, I mean this.
so there's this one, but that was the.
What's the one that has the references at the beginning? Yeah, that one.
Okay. Yeah. That's this one.
Or if they're on the desktop here, I can just grab them.
Oh, I can put them on the desktop, maybe.
Either way, whatever.
Um,
I'd rather emailed if I'm honest.
okay. So then this one.